Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Curtis. I'm Extension Wildlife Specialist and Professor at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Want to welcome you this afternoon to our Integrated Pest Management, Pesticide Safety Education Collaboration Team series on wildlife damage management. I'm going to do a couple things today. First, I'm going to go over a little bit of background and sort of how we got here and chose the subject of wildlife damage management. And then I'm going to focus on deer this afternoon and some of the things that you can do to reduce deer conflicts, particularly with landscape and horticultural plants. So let me introduce you to our team. The IPM PSC collaboration team has more than 30 individuals. Wayne Bueller at North Carolina State University is our chair. We represent a wide group of folks from academia, state government, industry, and our focus is primarily on improving educational resources for extension educators relating to IPM and pesticide safety. We started down this path when Wayne wanted to update and modify the pesticide stewardship website. And so we got looking at resources and found that there was a shortage of information on wildlife damage management under IPM and pesticide stewardship. And with some of the expertise on the existing committee, we added a new web section to the website on wildlife damage management, and that's available to everyone. And also that site is mobile friendly. And so that's where we started down the path of wildlife damage. We like to think of wildlife damage management from sort of an IPM perspective, or what we call PAMS. We're looking at trying to prevent conflicts first, avoid them when we can by making areas unattractive, do regular monitoring to try to know when and where damage is occurring, and then as sort of the last option, suppression or actual animal removal, thinking of it as a Swiss cheese type of model. We started down the path looking at wildlife damage management needs. The problem is we're seeing increased urbanization across the country. People tend to have a decline in familiarity with wildlife with people from urban backgrounds, and there's an increasing need for research-based information on resolving human-wildlife conflicts. The initial plan was started with a grant from the Western IPM Center. Most extension educators across the country have background in either things like production agriculture, horticulture, youth education, work with master gardener volunteer, forestry background. But there's only a handful of specialists across the country that have a background in wildlife damage management. And that's a very specialized niche within the extension arena. So we conducted a survey of extension educators, again, starting with the Western IPM region, and we broadened it across the country. And we wanted to identify ways they wanted to receive training or information. With our national survey, we ended up with 731 total responses from 48 states and 4 U.S. territories. For some reason, about half the respondents decided not to mark the location they responded from, but for those that had location data, we summarized responses based on the 4 IPM regions, the North Central, Northeastern, Southern, and Western region. We asked educators about the average number of wildlife damage related questions they fielded per year, and folks said that they handle on average about 48 questions from homeowners or renters, 42 from farmers, and 36 from wildlife related professionals. So getting well over 100 questions per educator on wildlife damage related topic. And we asked the question, compared with previous year, are the numbers increasing, decreasing, the same? And by far, 45% said they were increasing, 52% said they were staying the same. Only 3% said that the number of questions they receive are decreasing. So this seems to be an important area with a lack of information. We also asked folks in the Western region what the top 5 vertebrate pests were. And the ones that got the greatest number of mentions were coyotes, deer, rodents, pocket gophers, raccoons. And so based on this input, we decided to focus on things that people could potentially handle or manage well on their own, things like deer and rodent issues. Coyotes usually require pretty specialized expertise and also professional expertise to manage coyote problems effectively. So that's why we focused on deer for this initial uh, webinar today. We also asked specialists what do they use to gain information, and by far and away the number one source for wildlife damage info was extension publication. Internet browser was second, wildlife agencies, and then extension specialists. And the preferred format of technical training was webinars, 1 hour long. So hence this is first of a series of 4 webinars devoted to different topics. Second preference was online courses with self-directed study. And we're also developing a companion online course that we hope to roll out in the next 6 months or so. So we're trying to address the needs that were expressed in the national survey. So with that bit of background, I'm going to dive into now dealing with deer, particularly in suburban landscapes. Suburban deer issues are often a bit different from rural issues. With rural issues, it's usually agricultural and forestry problem. With urban situation, there are often 3 different drivers that can create conflict. One is damage to plants, either garden plants, landscape ornamentals, those type of things. Could be in a community is having excessive number of deer vehicle accidents and cost and safety issues are a problem, or it could be related to tick-borne diseases and tick-vectoring diseases that deer carry. So it's a different suite of problems in these urban suburban areas. The management methods that are available to handle deer, things like habitat modification, exclusion, such as fencing or netting, frightening methods, direct removal, trapping or shooting, and then in some states are experimenting with fertility control. We'll talk briefly about each one of these before we get into more detail. So the biggest thing people can do in terms of habitat modification is plant selection. It's possible to design more deer-resistant landscapes. No planting out there is completely deer-proof, but there are definitely preferences that deer show through different ornamental plants. And we'll go over some different plant lists a little bit later on. The second option is exclusion. And the 2 most common techniques are netting, if you've just got a small area or individual plants that need protection, or fencing for home gardens, agricultural fields, larger area. And if you're going to exclude deer with fences, they need to be at least 8 feet high. Deer can easily clear a 6-foot fence. Rarely can they make it over an 8-foot fence. So you need to have pretty substantial fencing if you're going to protect plant materials from deer. Frightening methods include things like auditory repellents and noise-making devices, visual repellents such as coyote decoys that you can put in turf grass areas to try to keep deer off the lawns and other places, odor repellents such as the deer off, and then ultrasonics. And ultrasonics are really not effective at all for deer, but there are some devices on the market. That's one thing I want to really emphasize, that whenever you're looking at say a repellent product, read the label. Most of these things have very limited research evidence on how well they work and they don't. And we're not even sure deer can hear in the ultrasonic range, so no surprise that the ultrasonics don't work that well. Deer removal, by far, the single technique that's most widely used is recreational hunting. Deer are hunted in just about every state. State wildlife agencies manage hunting programs to try to reduce potential conflict, and that works quite well in many rural areas where you have access to deer and land available for hunting. It doesn't work well in suburbia, where there may be discharge ordinances that communities have because of perceived safety concerns. But by far, the vast majority of deer that are removed on an annual basis, it's with hunting. We have specialized ways we can remove deer for research purposes or for what we call culling programs where there's an issue where we have to get deer off the landscape. We can use drop door traps such as the clover trap in the upper right photo or drop nets in the lower left photo. We want to catch entire family groups. For individual animal removal, darting at night is a very effective technique. And then for, again, many culling operations in suburban areas, professional sharpshooters can come in and remove animals that way. So we have ways we can get deer numbers reduced, but a lot comes down to what the public desires, what's going to be acceptable in any given community. And so you've got to look at public opinion and public support for any type of program. Fertility control, I'm just going to briefly mention here. We can do another whole webinar just on fertility control and what works and what doesn't. But there's two means that have been used in the last couple of decades. One is immunocontraception. That's where you inject deer or other wild animals with a vaccine that causes them to reduce fertility. For deer, there are two vaccines that were registered by US EPA. One is gonocon, gonadotropin releasing hormone vaccine, works well on both males and females. The other is zonistat, which is a point-of-zona pellucida vaccine, affects conception at the ovum level, only works on female deer. The problem with any of these contraceptive vaccines is that in most states they're still experimental. They're not used for management, and they're expensive and requiring boosting. Just like when we get vaccination, we've got to go back every year or 2 years, depending on the type of vaccination we get, and get boosted. No different with deer. The immunocontraceptive vaccines provide pretty good fertility control, about 80% efficacy for a year or two, but then the deer have to be boosted. For that reason, we're seeing more programs going with surgical sterilization. The advantage of surgical sterilization is you only have to handle the deer once, spay or neuter it, just like you do with your domestic pets. The big cost of implementing these things are getting deer in hand, inject them with vaccines, or even getting them within dart rifle range is enormously expensive. So surgical sterilization has the advantage that you only have to handle the animal once. Why are we talking about deer? What are the issues and problems that they cause? So in many urban areas, deer vehicle accidents are a major concern. New York State estimates they hit somewhere in the neighborhood of 70,000 deer plus on our highways every year. State of Pennsylvania, a number of years ago, were estimating they were hitting more than 100,000 deer a year on Pennsylvania roads. So there's a significant cost for vehicle repairs. There's a significant cost for health and safety issues. National databases show that about 4% of deer vehicle accidents result in a human injury of some type, plus the loss of the deer themselves. Crop damage is another big issue. About 2 decades ago, we did a survey of deer damage to agriculture in New York, and was estimated that time working with Farm Bureau that deer were causing $59 million a year in crop damage 2 decades ago. And that number has probably only increased over time. Damage to landscape ornamentals. In the photo on the upper right, you can see the deer browse line about 5.5, 6 feet above ground on the ewes on both sides of that porch. Deer really does cause significant damage to woody ornamentals during the winter months in the northern states. Forest regeneration failures in the lower right. Many times now, deer are so abundant that when we cut hardwood stands to regenerate them, is you get year after year of these knee-high sort of seedling saplings that grow up, and they never get out of the reach of deer, so the forest doesn't regenerate properly. And that affects songbird and reptiles, amphibians, a host of other wildlife when you lose that shrubby layer and that overstory forest. And that influences the type of plants that eventually come in. You get things like invasive barberry that can create more problems with deer ticks and other tick species that pass diseases on people from wildlife. Mike Conover did a national survey of deer-related vehicle accidents in the U.S. back in the early 90s. So again, that's 3 decades ago now. And at that point in time, he estimated we hit somewhere in the neighborhood of 726,000 deer a year on U.S. roads. And I think that's a huge underestimate. We know from our survey work in New York that usually only 20 to 50% of the actual number of deer-related vehicle accidents are ever reported. People don't want their insurance to go up. Sometimes accidents are minor. People don't bother to report. And so let's say that be conservative and say that half the accidents actually got reported in 91. That means in high probability there were at least 1.5 million deer vehicle accidents that year at an average cost of $3,500 per collision for repairs. That's $5 billion a year in economic repairs for vehicle alone, and that doesn't consider lost work time or health and safety issues associated with deer vehicle collision. We also know from national crash databases that deer collisions are responsible for 200 plus human fatalities for each year. And the issue here is that it's not so much people hitting the deer per se, it's what people do to avoid hitting the deer. And they swerve sharply, lose control of their vehicle. They slide off the road and run into a bridge abutment, run into a tree, and that's where the human injuries and fatalities occur. So I always tell folks, if you're driving and a deer runs out in front of you, can't avoid hitting it, hit the deer. That's the softest thing your vehicle is going to hit. You can repair that. Not the same for moose. Moose are much larger. A moose will come through your windshield, and that's going to cause a huge amount of problems. But for deer, they're going to usually bounce off the front bumper. What can we do to reduce deer vehicle accidents? Education is the single biggest thing. We know from data that's been collected over the years that about 2/3 of the accidents that occur each year occur during October, November, and December in the northeastern states. Reason for that? November is the peak of the rut, the peak of deer breeding season. Bucks are chasing does. They're not paying attention. They're crossing roads more frequently. And so the potential for deer vehicle accident, the probability of contact goes way up during those 3 months. We also know from looking at crash databases that the bulk of the actions occur near dawn and dusk. So you need to use extra care driving during those times because that's the peak in deer activity. Deer tend to bed down a lot during the day, so you get fewer accidents during the day, and people aren't as active during the middle of the night. So it's that dawn or dusk window that tends to be problematic. Deer are creatures of habit. If you see deer crossing a road in area once on your normal daily drive to work, school, wherever, they're likely to cross there again. They use the same trails year in and year out, and same family groups will pass those experiences on. At night, scan the roadside for eye reflection. You think of a bright, shiny spot about the size of a 50-cent piece. That's about the size of a deer eye. And that's the first thing you'll see in your high beams on a dark road at night. So you want to think about that when you're driving at night. It might give you an extra second or two to slow down and use caution. And that might avoid a collision with deer crossing the road in front of you. And I also encourage communities to manage herd density wherever possible. Deer vehicle collisions are based on probability of contact, where you have higher deer densities, 100, 150 deer per square mile. Some communities and high-speed roads, you're going to have greater numbers of deer vehicle accidents. These are data collected in New York. They're old data, but they're still very relevant. It shows the peak in deer vehicle collisions during that October, November window each fall. There's a secondary peak in accidents that don't show up here. That occurs during late April in the May. What's happening then? In May, adult does are getting ready to drop their new fawn crop for the year. Deer breed, again, peak of breeding is in November, peak of birthing is in May and in early June. And so when the adult doe gives birth to new fawns, she kicks last year's young out of her home range. So she has enough resources to raise the new fawn. That means you've got yearling deer, year-old deer that are wandering the landscape for the first time without their mother. And they've got to set up their own home ranges and establish their own behavior patterns away from mom. And again, they wander, they cross roads, and we see a blip that doesn't show up in this data set. People have tried lots of things to try to reduce deer vehicle collision. These are Squareflex reflectors. These triangular red plastic pieces are supposed to reflect bright headlights at night and reflected out at a 45-degree angle along the roadside to alert deer that a vehicle is approaching. Results have been mixed at best. There's no ecological reason for deer to pay any attention to red light. It doesn't mean anything to them. And so even in the best case scenario, number of accidents reduction has been very low. And so even though we saw these were very popular a couple decades ago, I rarely see them used nowadays. They're just not effective. Same thing with ultrasonic bells and whistles that you can put on the front bumper of your car 20 years ago. These were very popular and they were sold all over the place, claiming to reduce deer vehicle accidents. But again, there's no research data that show these things work. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not even sure deer can hear in the ultrasonic range. So again, buyer beware. A manufacturer doesn't have to prove something works to sell. All they have to do is prove it's safe. Tick-borne diseases are on the increase in many parts of the Northeast. I'm going to focus on New York because that's where my background is from. We know the number of reported tick-borne disease cases in the U.S. more than doubled between 2004 and 2016. And during that time period, 7 new pathogens were discovered or recognized in the U.S. that are able to infect people. About 30 species of ticks are found in New York and many other northeastern states, 10 commonly bite human, but only 4 in the Northeast are very important for disease transmission to people and pets. By far and away, the most important is the black-legged or deer tick, Ixodes scapularis, the American dog tick, Lone Star tick, and the woodchuck tick. I'm going to talk a bit more about each of these. We look at diseases transmitted. The American dog tick spreads Rocky Mountain spotted fever. The Lone Star tick is associated with ehrlichiosis, very similar symptoms to Lyme disease, but a different disease. Also, the Lone Star ticks are associated with the newer red meat allergy that some people pick up after being bitten by ticks. You may read about that in recent publications. Black-legged or deer ticks are the primary vectors for Lyme disease, but Lyme is not the only disease. By far and away, Lyme is the single most important tick-borne disease in the Northeast, but other diseases are also increasing in prevalence. Things like babesiosis, anaplasmosis, and Powassan virus, very low prevalence right now, but we're concerned are that those could increase. And then the woodchuck tick passes on Powassan virus. These changes are happening very rapidly. I just pulled a series of maps from the New York State Department of Health website just to show how quickly Lyme disease is becoming more and more prevalent across our state here in New York. So if you look at 2013, a lot of areas are light blue. Lyme disease has been an ongoing issue for decades in the lower Hudson Valley and Long Island. But by just after 5 years, you can see how much more dark blue area there is in our state. And even within the core areas, the number of cases are increasing. So again, it's an issue that really need to address. So what can we do? How do we manage tick-borne diseases? Well, some communities try direct reductions in deer densities, and I put question marks there. Very few areas have shown reductions in tick numbers and tick population crashes by reducing deer numbers. Those are usually on island studies where deer can't freely move in and off the island once animals are shot and removed from an area. What we know from the literature and experience is that black-legged tick populations tend to crash when deer densities are reduced below 10 deer per square mile. In most urban, suburban areas, Northeast, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get deer densities that low. So given that situation, it's probably best to consider fencing to exclude deer from sensitive areas. Things like children's playground, urban parks where you've got very high human use, particularly by children. We don't want deer wandering across those landscapes and dropping ticks that kids might pick up in particular. So it might be good to fence deer out of those areas completely. Some communities are experimenting with four-poster devices. That's a self-application of a caricide like permethrin to deer via a feeding station. The picture on the lower right shows deer at a four-poster station. The center hopper contains 200 pounds of corn. The corn feeds out the feeding trough on both ends with paint roller. Certified pesticide applicator treats the paint roller with permethrin, so when deer reach in, they get corn out of the trough. They self-medicate their head and neck area, and it's been shown to reduce tick densities on deer by 90% or more in some areas when the devices are applied properly. And deer carry extremely high tick loads, and they like the ears, and you see in this upper right photo, because the ears, the blood vessels with very low levels of fur, so it's easy for ticks to attach and get a blood meal. So deer ears are good indicators of tick loads in an area. There's a newer device that's being tested in several states right now, Lyme Shield device. That is a vaccine that given to rodents, particularly mice that are the reservoir for Lyme disease. The mice come to the bait station, they feed, and then they self-vaccinate themselves. We don't have enough good data at this point to say how well this device works, but the Federal Center for Disease Control is conducting ongoing tests right now. And the last thing is some landscaping practices. I want to talk a bit more about that. You can try to create a more tick-safe zone on home properties. Black-legged ticks in particular are a cool season tick. They like shady, moist area. So with black-legged ticks, they're going to be in the shrub areas on the border yard. They don't like open mown grass areas in bright sun. They desiccate very easily. So if you can put a border around your yard, say of wood chips or even a stone border, and then try to keep garden plants or children's play areas at least 3 yards inside from that border, very unlikely that a tick's going to cross from here in the shrubby protected area out to this area of the yard without being carried by something. So it doesn't mean you won't ever find a tick in a yard that's landscaped properly, but it reduces the chance that the ticks will get there on their own. Something's going to have to carry the tick in and drop it. I want to sort of switch gears now and talk about landscape plant damage. Back in the mid-90s, there was a national survey done that estimated 2.4 million U.S. homes were impacted by deer damaged ornamental plants annually at a cost of $250 million or more a year. I think that's a huge underestimate, to be honest. We did a survey back in the late 80s in Westchester County, New York, and in one county in our state, we estimated that homeowners lost between $6.5 and $9.5 million in ornamental plants. What we learned from that survey is that average plant replacement cost per home that had deer damage was about $500, and things that tend to be evergreen in the winter months, yews, rhododendron, arborvitae, were the plants that deer seek out. And we'll talk about some of these plant lists in a few moments. Like to think about managing deer, again, from an IPM or integrated pest management perspective. So that means on any given site, we've got a number of different things we could potentially use or balance. So we can look at plant selection, designing more deer-resistant landscapes, fencing to exclude deer, direct reduction in deer management or hunting or some other form, or repellents to make plants less palatable to deer. So it's some combination of these four techniques on any given property. Some general rule of thumb: repellents tend to work when the deer feeding pressure and damage is in light. What I mean by that is deer aren't in the lawn every day, or they're not in the landscape every evening. They show up occasionally, do a little bit of damage to plant, eat a few flowers or garden plants, and then move on somewhere else. Fencing or a physical barrier of some type provides the only reliable control when deer damage gets moderate to heavy. That's where deer in the landscape almost daily. They're doing structural damage to woody ornamental. They're decimating your prized flower plantings or your garden plants. And so you're going to have to put up a barrier of some type. Again, managing herd density wherever possible is important. We know each adult deer eats on average about 8 pounds of forage a day. So if you figure you've got maybe 6, 8 deer that are using your landscape, that's a lot of pounds of plant material that can potentially disappear. You can choose plants and design more deer-resistant landscapes. And again, in just a moment, we'll go over those. And at least in New York State, deer feeding is illegal. And if you're feeding deer within 300 foot of a public highway in New York, you can be ticketed by a law enforcement officer. So how do we reduce abundance? As we mentioned earlier, by far, recreational hunting is the most common technique. Several thousands of deer are harvested in most of the eastern states each year. I know in New York State, sometimes we harvest as many as 150 or 200,000 deer during a typical hunting season. So whenever you can, try to use recreational hunting. It's the least costly way to reduce deer numbers and deer damage. Most of the northeastern states have additional permits that are available to farm and forest landowners to help control damage and regenerate our forest or reduce crop damage. The two type of permits in New York, what we call DMAP or Deer Management Assistance Program permits. Those are permits given out to private landowners by our state wildlife agency for taking antlerless deer during the normal hunting season. So the landowner applies to our state wildlife agency. Landowner gets the permit. The landowner invites hunters onto their property to harvest female deer and reduce numbers. Deer damage permits, on the other hand, in New York, are for taking deer outside the normal hunting season. So let's say you're a strawberry grower in New York and your crop's coming on, you want to harvest your strawberries in early June, but you're finding the deer coming in at night and damaging your strawberry. Well, a grower can contact our wildlife agency and get a permit to shoot or remove a certain number of deer depending on the level of damage. And when you're using damage permits, it's not hunting, it's culling. You can shoot deer at night, you can shoot deer over bait piles. Those are all things that are illegal during the regular hunting. Then finally, the last category of permits are what we call licensed to collect to possess. Those type of permits are given out for urban deer research, for deer research we were doing with fertility control, and again, not generally available to the public, but for research staff. Exclusion. Anybody can practice deer exclusion around their home landscape. The fence on the lower left was my home garden in Ithaca several years ago. That we were the last people gardening in our part of the community because we had about 125 deer per square mile roughly in our neighborhood, and most people gave up trying to grow garden plants. But I put up a 8-foot high fence and was able to garden successfully. And individual plant protection, the photo on the right is the Cornell University Arboretum. our Arboretum staff spend about $20,000 to $25,000 a year putting up these individual cages and spraying repellents to protect our collection from deer damage. So this is an expensive annual proposition. And then in some cases, for small home garden settings, electric fences are viable, or for small agricultural fields, less than 5 acres, sometimes electric fences work well to protect crops during the growing season. I want to talk a bit about deer repellents. If you go to your local farm supply store, you're going to get overwhelmed with things that are on the shelf. Most of these products have never been tested under research setting. Uh, Generally, a few years ago, there were a number of ingredients that were added to the FIFA 25B list, or what we call generally regarded as safe active ingredients. These are things like herbs and odoring agents and other things that uh, potentially could repel animals, but were considered safe by US EPA. And the market for deer repellents just proliferated with a number of these new things. And all these companies, again, were making claims about how well their repellent worked. Granted, some of these repellents may work quite well. Others do very little. You need to pay close attention to what the active ingredients are. There's only a few active ingredients that really work as deer repellent. Initially, US EPA required registration of certain active ingredients, things like capsaicin or soap or Thyrum, a fungicide that has deer repellent properties, things like denatonium benzoate, bittering agents. And so about 15, 20 years ago, there were only a handful of deer repellents on the market. And we had a research base for these because they required EPA registration. And for example, big game repellent, or deer away, as it was called at the time, tended to be one of the most successful deer repellents. And the active ingredient in that was putrescent egg solids, or rotten egg. Deer just don't like the smell of rotten egg. I don't either, but big game repellent was a really decent deer repellent. Deer also don't like smell of some of the soap-based products, and so hinder the soap-based product. Chew knot and deer knot at the time had either Thyrum or a mixture of Thyrum and capsaicin, which are both things that will cause either a very poor taste or an irritation in the mouth. So at least we have data and experience with these type of products, but most of the things that are on the shelf now, again, have never been thoroughly tested. The way we test deer repellents is to use yews as a test plant material. Yews are deer candy in winter. Deer love them and will seek them out in the winter landscape. So we usually spray the plant material with a specific deer repellent in greenhouses, and then take them out and put them afield in homeowners' backyards where we know there are high deer density. We test during the winter months. That's when deer fat reserves are lowest. That's when deer are the hungriest. So it gives us the best test of what works and what doesn't as a deer repellent. What we would do is put the yews out, then take digital pictures of each plant, either on a weekly or a monthly basis, and then take those plant photos in and analyze them and look at the proportion of plant removed. And here on the photo on the right, this yew's been in the field about 2 weeks. I can tell from the ribbons it was one of our control plants with no spray on it. And after 2 weeks, about half the plant surface area has been removed. So what do we learn during our repellent trial? Well, things that tend to have rotten egg as a primary active ingredient work best. This is 4 different materials up here: big game repellent spray mix, deer stopper tube, and one of the other products, just so I can see, deer off. All 4 of those products at that point in time had putrescent egg solid as a primary active ingredient. Controls, the untreated or the yellow triangle. Couple take-home messages. Even the best repellents lose efficacy after about 4 to 5 weeks. By 6 weeks out, they're starting to really show evidence of damage. And by the time you're 8 weeks out into the winter, they're really not significantly different from controls. Now, again, if you're able to retreat the plant material during the winter months uh, and respray after 4 to 5 weeks, that increases the efficacy again. But when we've got snow and freezing temperatures all winter long in the northern states like New York or Wisconsin or Minnesota, you're not going to be able to spray in December, January, or February. So essentially after a month, say you put your last application on in November sometime before first snowfall. Well, by the end of December, those plants are essentially unprotected for the rest of the winter. Things changed a little bit. A new novel deer repellent entered the market here in the US about 3-4 years ago. It's called Trico Pro. It's produced in Austria and Europe. I started a conversation with some of the folks over there that were using it to protect forest plantings from red deer and other European deer. And they were willing to ship us some material to test here in the United States. We set up a repellent trial in Rochester, New York area, where we had, again, ewes that we used during the winter months. We had 4 sites, and we randomly assigned treatments, tricho, control, and plant skid. Plant skid is a commonly used deer repellent currently over the market that gets some favorable reviews, and we wanted to see how well tricho compared to the control and the plant skid. Here's some digital camera images we took. This was at our Pine Grove Ave site in Rochester. You can see the adult doe on the right with her 2 fawns from the last summer coming in and feeding on the taxus in our plant layout there. So again, taxus are again like deer candy during the winter months. The way we evaluated how well the repellents worked, we sprayed plants at our cooperative extension greenhouse, held them dry overnight, and then carried the plants out to the field in vehicles and trailers and set them up on site. Any plant that had 0 damage, no deer browsing, we gave a score of 0 at the end of the trial. And we evaluated plants during first week in April during spring greenup. Plants were sprayed during late November and put out in the field then. Any plant that had from 1 to 20% damaged tips or missing tips, we gave a score of 1. From 21 to 40% missing, we gave a score of 2. 41 to 60% missing, we gave a score of 3, and so on till you get out here to a score of 5. 80% or more of the plant surface area is gone. So that gives you sort of a relative feel for what these scores mean. Our results at our Birch Hills Dry site, we had fairly high deer feeding pressure. All the control plants, the seed, and all the plant skids were scores of 5s, meaning there wasn't any foliage left on those. The tricho treated plants had a primarily score of 0. Fairview Crescent, the deer feeding pressure was a bit lighter. Again, all the control plants were hammered, had scores of 5. Some of the plant skid plants had some damage on them, mostly at the 1 to 2 range. None of the tricho plants were damaged at Fairview Crescent. At the Pine Grove Ave site where you saw the video, nothing worked. Everything failed. All the plants at the end of the research trial had scores of 5. So the important take-home message here is there's no deer repellent out there that's 100% effective. If deer in the landscape feeding every night and they're food stressed, they're going to eat what's there. Doesn't matter what repellent you spray on it. And we saw that at the Pine Grove Ave site. And then the St. Paul Boulevard site that had the lowest deer feeding pressure, both uh, the trico and the plant skid worked really well, very little damage, but the control plants were hammered pretty heavily. So another take-home message is deer feeding pressure is extremely variable site to site. So just because something works at one site doesn't mean it's going to work somewhere else. Another technique that we've used for summer protection, deer love, daylily flower heads, Asiatic lily flower heads, simple rope barrier fence for home gardens, small home garden bedding areas, and protect flowers and small garden plots from deer damage. Easy to construct, very inexpensive. So you've got metal stakes around the perimeter, piece of white cotton cord, and then on each side there are these green flags, and we sprayed those with big game repellent. If you trust an egg solid repellent, it's got a very strong odor. What reason this fence works is that deer can obviously cross it anytime they want, but when they walk up to it, the rope makes them stop. Then they've got to decide what to do. Well, am I going to crawl under it? Am I going to jump over it? And while they're figuring out if they want to cross the rope or not, they get a whiff of the repellent on the flag, and that's usually enough to turn them away. And you can see the flower density here is much different than there, and they were very similar when we started. This is our control bed. There are a number of home remedy repellents that are in the extension literature. If you look at old extension publications, things like human hair, soap bars, animal waste, blood meals, all these things do have some deer repellency, but they're not reliable. They haven't been tested, and at least in New York State, home remedies cannot be recommended by extension staff. Mentioned deer feeding pressure. A lot of things influence that from site to site. One of the biggest is deer population density. You have 30, 40 deer per square mile in your community, or do you have 140 deer per square mile? Huge difference in the amount of plant material that's going to be eaten. Food and cover sources and travel corridors are important. That Pine Grove Ave site that had such high deer feeding pressure, that was right on a travel corridor. We didn't realize that between a park area and a feeding area in the community. So deer were on that property every night looking for something to eat. That's extremely high deer feeding pressure. Alternative foods and season and weather are important. Again, deer will take things during a tough winter with deep persistent snow that we might not otherwise touch. Weather impacts deer fat reserve. So the longer you have snow cover on the ground and poor winter browse for deer to feed on, the more their body fat reserve that they exhaust. Deer nutrition and palatability is important. Deer seek out nitrogen in the landscape and in plants. And what do? We fertilize our plants. We fertilize our landscape ornamentals, our garden plant. That's extracting the deer. They're looking for nitrogen. And then finally, previous experience. The fawns will follow the adult doe around during that first year of life, and they learn from her what's good to eat and what's not good to eat. So we put together a plant list over the years for woody ornamentals. There are a few that we say are very deer resistant, not deer proof, deer resistant. And deer will eat anything when hungry enough. Northeastern ornamentals, though, that are rarely damaged by deer include things like boxwood and Russian olive and American holly, Colorado blue spruce. All these plants tend to have leaves that are very stiff and spiny with low nutrition, or things like boxwood that have some type of secondary compounds that deer just don't like. But this list is very short, as you'll notice. A handful of plants tend to be very deer resistant. On the other end of the spectrum, there are ornamental to deer frequently severely damaged, or the Christmas tree. The ones that get the most heavy damage are balsam and Fraser fir. Your fruit trees, your plums, your cherries, things like that, deer seek out. Atlantic white cedar, American arborvitae, yew, and things that have soft needles or foliage that are evergreen in the winter months. rhododendrons, azaleas, things that have nice big fleshy blooms that are buds that deer can consume. So even at least in the Northeast, even if deer numbers are relatively low and it's not a particularly tough winter, these type of plants will probably require protection because deer are seeking these things out in the winter landscape. We also got questioned years ago about perennial bulbs and which ones were deer resistant and which ones weren't. So we designed a trial looking at many different varieties, over 30 varieties of perennial bulb. We grew the bulbs in greenhouses on the Cornell campus, and then we took them out and put them in the homeowner's backyard, cafeteria style, along rows of tray potted plants where deer could walk up and down the road and pick and choose what they wanted to eat and what they didn't like. Bulbs that were included in the field trial included things like narcissus, daffodils, hyacinths, crocus, irises. You can read on down the list. And we compared all those against tulips. We know tulips are the favorite perennial bulb. Deer love to browse on tulips, doesn't matter the variety. And what we found from our bulb trial is that there are essentially three types of common perennial bulbs that deer seek out in the landscape. Obviously, the highest damage score for on genus 2 are tulips. Surprisingly, second highest with genus 4, crocuses, and the third highest level of damage, which is again substantially lower than the other two, is Canadoxa. So if you can avoid planting these three perennial bulbs, just about everything else is fairly deer resistant. Deer rarely damage daffodils or hyacinth, rarely damage iris or allium. And so most of the spring bulbs are deer resistant. We also at the time had a captive bull colony, so we could take bulbs that we tried in the deer trial on the deer didn't eat and put those in with our captive bull colony to see which ones the bulbs damaged. And no big surprise, the bulbs that were deer resistant also ended up being bull resistant. In fact, we learned that this colchicum autumnale, the colchicum was actually toxic to bulls. And we, after the first feeding, we had to stop the trial because it killed a couple of our animals. And so these plants have some type of secondary compound or secondary structures that herbivores find that they really don't like. Finally, the last type of deer damage I want to talk about today is rubbing damage. That's where bucks during the fall, if they're preparing for rut, go through a large number of trees and mark them by rubbing their antlers, trying to do a couple of things. One, a rub is a visual cue. By rubbing the bark, you get to the very bright white underlayer that shines and shows up in moonlight. Deer also have scent glands on their foreheads, so they leave scent there, telling animals that this is my turf. And then also, when the velvet gets ready to shed on the mature antlers, by rubbing the trees, it rubs the velvet off the antlers. What we've learned over the years is rubbing damage is extremely difficult to stop. Deer aren't feeding on these shrubs, so deer repellents tend not to work. But the only thing you can do is fence deer out of the area completely, or get a permit from the state wildlife agency to try to remove the offending buck if it's say a commercial nursery or evergreen operation. And those permits can be very difficult to get. So I'm going to wrap up. We've got about 5 minutes left today. What are some lessons that we've learned over the years by working with deer the last 25, 30 years? One, it's impossible to design more deer-resistant landscapes with careful plant selection. Exclusion provides the best long-term protection for plants, be it netting or fencing. Deer repellents can be successful for short-term plant protection if you've got the right active ingredients, things like the sheep fat in the tricho product or putrescent egg solids and some of the other materials. Hunting is the primary method for reducing deer numbers at a landscape scale, but we've learned that hunting alone is unlikely to reduce deer abundance to levels where forests will regenerate, our crops will be protected, and hunting it's extremely difficult to do it effectively in urban and suburban areas because of private land restrictions, discharge ordinance, and those type of things. We've learned that fertility control can reduce deer abundance on small areas, but it's extremely expensive, and in most states it's still considered experimental, so it's not a management tool that's available. With that, just want to give you a couple of resources. My wildlifecontrol.info website has a number of PDF files and fact sheets that are available for free. I think as a follow-up for folks that are registered, I'm going to send a couple of these files to the Extension Foundation to include with a follow-up mailing after this presentation. For folks that are interested in potentially becoming professional wildlife control operators or more professional training course, we have wildlife control training books and resources, an online course that's recognized in 10 states. So if somebody wants to get certified and licensed to do wildlife control work, you can do that. With that, I'll stop, and I'm going to leave my screen up here for just a few seconds. Feel free to unmute your microphone. I'll try to handle a couple of questions before we close. Melanie, is there anything in the chat? I wasn't monitoring chat as we went along. I can't.
Yes, Paul, we have quite a few questions in chat. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but I was thinking that maybe we can work on a Q&A that can go in the follow-up email, so you can answer those
That would
that
be
we
great.
didn't
Yeah,
get
I
to.
can answer those and then send it out in the follow-up email. So we'll, Melanie, if you can download those and get those to me, I will work on responses to those questions.
Yes, definitely. And then just to reiterate, we will be sending the slides, the recording, and then all the questions that you have in chat out in email later this week, hopefully, or early next week. So be looking out for that. And then it looks like we're at the top of the hour. So if you want to say any last things, Paul.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody's attention today. Feel free to sign up for our webinar next week. This is a weekly series. Dr. Stephen Van Tassel is going to be talking about road management, Stephen, Montana Ag Department in the West. So hopefully see some repeat viewers next week. Thank you.